The sound of glass shattering and steel crunching tore through the quiet suburban morning. My truck, my pride, my lifeline, wasn't just vandalized. It was deliberately smashed to pieces. And standing there with a smug grin, Karen, clutching a bat like it was her crown of authority. I stood frozen in my doorway, coffee mug still steaming in my hand, watching shards of my windshield catch the morning sun like 1,000 broken promises. The headlights, those same lights that had cut through countless dark nights on dangerous roads, were nothing but twisted metal and plastic fragments scattered across the pristine concrete driveway. My truck, my goddamn truck. She wasn't just any vehicle. She was a 2019 Ford F-150, midnight black with reinforced steel plating underneath, bullet-resistant windows that had saved my life more times than I cared to count, and a custom suspension system that could handle terrain most people only saw in nightmares. The exterior looked civilian enough, had to for undercover work, but every dent, every scratch, every worn spot on the steering wheel told a story of service, sacrifice, and survival. The deep gouge along the driver's side door wasn't from some parking lot mishap. That was from shrapnel in Kabul, 2018. The slightly faded paint on the hood covered up where we'd hastily spray-painted over bullet holes after a drug bust went sideways. The reinforced bumper had pushed through more roadblocks than I could remember, and the custom radio mount still held the bracket where my emergency communications gear used to sit. This truck had been my partner, my shield, my home away from home during the worst and best years of my life. She'd carried wounded teammates to safety, hauled evidence that put killers behind bars, and served as my mobile command center during operations that would make your blood run cold. Every morning for 8 years, I'd run my hand along her hood before climbing in. A ritual of respect and gratitude. And now she was destroyed. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I shouted, finally finding my voice as I rushed down my front steps. The coffee mug hit the pavement and exploded, adding to the chaos of glass and ceramic. Karen Weatherby, all 5 feet and 3 inches of suburban entitlement wrapped in a pink velour tracksuit, hefted the aluminum baseball bat higher, like she was ready for another swing. Her bleached blonde hair was perfectly curled despite the early hour. Her makeup applied with the precision of someone who treated every day like a performance. She'd moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago and had immediately appointed herself the unofficial queen of Maple Grove Estates. "I warned you." "Thompson!" she snarled, her voice carrying that particular brand of venom reserved for people who believed their homeowners association position made them royalty. "I sent you 3 notices about that military junk cluttering up our beautiful neighborhood. Did you think I was kidding? Military junk?" The words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't military junk. This was a monument to service, a reminder of brothers and sisters who'd bled and died for something bigger than themselves. This truck had been more than transportation. She'd been a lifeline, a symbol of everything I'd fought to protect. "You're insane," I managed, surveying the damage. The side mirrors hung by their cables like broken arms. The tailgate was crumpled inward, and I could see fluid leaking from somewhere underneath, probably the oil pan. Every window was spider-webbed with cracks or completely shattered. "I'm enforcing community standards," Karen replied with the self-righteous tone of someone who'd never been held accountable for anything in her life. Section 4.2(b) of the HOA Covenant clearly states that residents cannot park commercial or military-style vehicles in plain sight. Your eyesore was bringing down property values. Around us, neighbors had begun to emerge from their houses like prairie dogs sensing danger. Mrs. Chen from across the street stood on her porch in her bathrobe, hands pressed to her mouth. The Johnson family from next door huddled in their front window, 3 kids' faces pressed against the glass. Old Mr. Hendricks from down the block had walked halfway up his driveway, but stopped when he saw Karen's bat, choosing to observe from a safe distance. Not one of them said a word. Not one of them stepped forward to help or intervene. They just watched, silent witnesses to Karen's reign of terror, and I felt something cold and bitter settle in my chest. These were the people I'd served to protect. These were the neighbors I'd thought would stand by each other when it mattered. "You could have asked me to move it," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the rage building inside me like pressure in a boiler. "You could have knocked on my door and talked to me like a human being." Karen laughed. Actually laughed. A harsh sound that seemed to echo off the cookie-cutter houses surrounding us. "I don't negotiate with people who think they're above the rules. You military types are all the same. Think your service gives you special privileges. Well, welcome to reality, soldier boy. This is my neighborhood now. Her neighborhood." The entitlement was breathtaking. She'd been here 3 years. I'd been here 5. Had watched this place grow from raw construction into a community. I'd helped old Mr. Hendricks when his wife was sick. Had shoveled the Johnsons' driveway every snowstorm. Had been the one who organized the neighborhood watch program that kept our streets safe. But somehow, in Karen's twisted worldview, wearing a uniform and serving my country made me the problem. "The police are on their way," I said, pulling out my phone. My hands were surprisingly steady, muscle memory from years of staying calm under pressure. "Good," Karen sneered, finally lowering the bat. "Maybe they'll explain the law to you. Private property destruction is only a crime when it's really private property. That thing," she pointed the bat at my destroyed truck, "has government plates. Technically, I just did the taxpayers a favor by removing an abandoned government vehicle from our neighborhood." Government plates. She was right about that. And the fact that she knew it meant this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment tantrum. This was calculated, planned, researched. She'd been watching me, studying me, waiting for the right moment to strike. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that those plates weren't just government issue. They were state police task force plates. And that truck wasn't just some surplus military vehicle collecting dust. She was current, active, still technically assigned to operations even though I was on extended leave. As I waited for the local cops to arrive, watching Karen pace back and forth like she owned the street, I felt something settle into place in my mind. The same cold calculation that had kept me alive through 8 years of dangerous work. The same methodical thinking that had helped me track down killers and solve cases that left other investigators stumped. Karen Weatherby had no idea who she was dealing with. She saw a retired soldier trying to blend into suburban life, someone she could bully and intimidate with HOA rules and community pressure. She thought she'd just destroyed some nostalgic veteran's toy, made a statement about who really ran this neighborhood. She was about to learn the difference between a veteran and an active-duty state police task force operator. She was about to discover that my truck wasn't just my personal vehicle, it was evidence in ongoing investigations, equipment vital to state operations, and most importantly, it belonged to something far bigger and more dangerous than her little suburban kingdom. Karen thought she'd won this round, thought she'd put me in my place with one morning's work and a baseball bat. She had no clue what she had just destroyed or who she had just picked a fight with. The sound of sirens was already getting closer, and I found myself almost smiling despite the destruction around me. This was going to be interesting. Before I could fight back, you need to understand why that truck wasn't just mine. It belonged to something far greater than me. The memory hit me like a flashback as I stared at the wreckage. December 2016, somewhere in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Snow falling thick enough to blind you at 50 yards. Our convoy had been ambushed, and that same truck, my truck, had been our salvation. I was 26 then, still new enough to the State Police Task Force to second-guess every decision, but experienced enough to know when something was about to go very wrong. We'd been tracking a weapons trafficking ring that stretched from Detroit to Kandahar, following a lead that had taken us into Taliban territory, with nothing but hope and steel between us and eternity. The IED had taken out our lead vehicle, flipping it like a child's toy and leaving Martinez unconscious and bleeding in the driver's seat. Enemy fire was coming from 3 directions, and our communications were down. That's when Sergeant Hayes, God rest his soul, threw me the keys to what would become my truck and shouted over the gunfire, "Thompson, get Martinez out of here. That's not a request." What followed was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Racing down mountain roads that barely qualified as paths, Martinez's blood on my hands as I tried to keep pressure on his wounds while driving, enemy rounds spiderwebbing the windshield. The same windshield Karen had just shattered with her bat. The truck's armor plating had saved us both that night, and when we finally reached the forward operating base, Martinez was still breathing. He made it home to his wife and 3 kids because of that truck, because of her armor, her reinforced chassis, her ability to take punishment and keep moving. She'd been built for war and baptized in fire, and every dent and scratch was a badge of honor. But that was just one mission out of dozens. After Afghanistan, the truck came home with me to Michigan, where she became part of the State Police Task Force's tactical fleet. We'd modified her extensively, upgraded communications equipment, hidden compartments for surveillance gear, a custom suspension system that could handle high-speed pursuits on any terrain. Michigan could throw at us the faded paint Karen had dismissed as military. Junk, covered-up bullet holes from a shootout with domestic terrorists in 2019. The reinforced bumper had pushed through barricades during a hostage rescue in Grand Rapids. The worn spots on the seats came from countless nights of surveillance, waiting and watching as we built cases against some of the worst people society had to offer. That truck had been present for the arrest of Marcus "The Knife" Williams, a serial killer who'd terrorized Detroit for 3 years. She'd carried evidence that put away the Kozlov crime family, a Russian organization that had been trafficking women and children through the Great Lakes shipping routes. Her hidden cameras had recorded confessions from politicians, drug dealers, and murderers who thought they were untouchable. 8 years. 8 years of service, sacrifice, and brotherhood that Karen couldn't begin to understand. The task force wasn't just a job, it was a calling. A family forged in danger and bound by trust. We'd pulled each other out of burning buildings, covered each other's backs in firefights, and held each other together when the job tried to break us. Now I was on extended leave, dealing with what the department shrinks called operational stress and what everyone else called PTSD. Too many night raids, too many crime scenes, too many funerals for partners who didn't make it home. The truck was supposed to be my anchor to normal life, a reminder that I'd served with honor and had something to show for it. I'd moved to Maple Grove Estates specifically because it seemed like the kind of place where service mattered, where neighbors looked out for each other and respected what people had sacrificed. The houses were modest but well-maintained. The streets were safe, and the community seemed built on the values I'd spent my life defending. What I hadn't counted on was Karen. Weatherby, she'd moved in 3 years ago, like a tropical storm making landfall. All noise and destruction disguised as improvement. Within 6 months, she'd gotten herself elected to the HOA board and had immediately begun her campaign to turn our quiet neighborhood into her personal kingdom. It started small, the way it always does with bullies. A notice here about lawn height being 2 inches over regulation, a fine there for leaving garbage cans out an hour too long, a strongly worded letter about holiday decorations not conforming to community aesthetic standards. Most people just paid the fines and followed the rules, figuring it wasn't worth the fight. But Karen had bigger plans. She wanted complete control, wanted every resident to know that she was the queen of Maple Grove Estates, and they were all her subjects. She'd gotten the mailbox regulations changed to require expensive matching sets that just happened to be sold by her husband's landscaping company. She'd pushed through safety improvements that added speed bumps every 50 yards, speed bumps that were installed by her brother-in-law's construction firm. The more power she accumulated, the more brazen she became. Neighbors started whispering about cameras being installed to monitor compliance, about HOA meetings held in secret with no advance notice, about fines that seemed to target anyone who'd ever questioned her authority. And now she'd crossed the line from petty tyranny to outright destruction. She'd attacked not just my property, but federal property, because regardless of what the registration said, that truck was still part of ongoing task force operations. The modifications alone were worth more than most people's houses, and the intelligence equipment hidden in her custom compartments was classified at levels that would make Karen's head spin. What she thought was just some veteran's nostalgic toy was actually a sophisticated surveillance platform that had helped solve murders, break up trafficking rings, and keep the streets of Michigan safe. And she'd destroyed it with a baseball bat because it didn't fit her suburban aesthetic. As the first police cruiser pulled into my driveway, I felt that familiar sensation settling over me. The cold focus that had kept me alive through dozens of dangerous situations. Karen was still pacing back and forth, waving her bat and explaining to anyone who'd listen how she was just enforcing community standards and protecting property values. She had no idea that she'd just declared war on something far more dangerous than a neighborhood HOA dispute. She thought she was dealing with just another resident she could bully into submission. What she'd actually done was attack the Michigan State Police Task Force, destroy evidence in multiple ongoing investigations, and create a federal incident that would bring attention she definitely didn't want. The local cops were good people. I knew most of them from my time in law enforcement, but they had no idea what they were walking into. They'd see property damage, maybe a disorderly conduct charge, probably try to mediate between neighbors and file some paperwork. What they wouldn't see, what Karen couldn't possibly understand, was that she'd just kicked a hornet's nest that stretched from Detroit to Lansing to Washington, D.C. She'd picked a fight with people who made their living taking down criminals far more dangerous and connected than one suburban HOA president. She thought it was just a truck? I murmured to myself as the officers approached, their radios crackling with dispatch calls. She had no idea she'd just declared war on the state police task force's legacy. But I knew. And soon she would too. Smashing my truck wasn't enough. She wanted to break me piece by piece, and she had the entire HOA board wrapped around her finger. The citation appeared on my door 3 days after the truck incident, while I was still dealing with insurance adjusters and trying to coordinate with the task force's fleet management division. The official HOA letterhead made it look legitimate, but I recognized Karen's handiwork immediately. The same condescending tone, the same creative interpretation of rules that somehow always worked in her favor. Notice of violation. Case 212-224-847, it read. Property located at 1247 Maple Grove Drive has been found in violation of Community Covenant Section 6.42A. Improper lawn maintenance. Grass height exceeds regulation maximum of 3.5 inches by approximately 0.75 inches. Fine, $150. Compliance required within 72 hours or additional penalties will be assessed. I stood in my doorway, coffee growing cold in my hand, staring at a piece of paper that perfectly captured everything wrong with suburban power trips. My grass was maybe 4 inches tall in the longest spots, hardly the jungle Karen was making it out to be. I'd been dealing with insurance claims, police reports, and trying to explain to my task force commander why a civilian had destroyed $250,000 worth of specialized law enforcement equipment. Fleet management is having a collective aneurysm, he said. Do you know how much paperwork I've had to fill out explaining why one of our active tactical vehicles was destroyed in a suburban property dispute? Captain Morrison wants to know if you've lost your goddamn mind. Tell the captain I'm handling it, I said, watching as Karen emerged from her house in her morning jogging outfit, a coordinated pink and white ensemble that probably cost more than most people's car payments. But I'm going to need some advice on how to handle it properly. Document everything, Derek said without hesitation. If this woman is as unhinged as your incident report makes her sound, she's not going to stop with the truck. People like that escalate until someone stops them, and if she's got local power, she's going to use it. He was right, of course. Karen's behavior over the past few weeks had followed a predictable pattern of escalation that I'd seen in dozens of criminal cases. Start with small violations to establish dominance, increase pressure when the target doesn't submit, then escalate to more serious actions when intimidation tactics don't work. She was following the playbook of every petty dictator I'd ever investigated. "Here's what you're going to do," Derek continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone giving operational instructions. "Treat this like a case. Evidence collection, witness interviews, pattern documentation, the whole 9 yards. If she's corrupt enough to destroy police property, she's corrupt enough to be running other scams." "Already started," I said, pulling out the folder where I'd been collecting every citation, every notice, every piece of intimidation Karen had sent my way. She's been systematically targeting me with bogus violations, and I think she's been tampering with federal mail. But Derek, it's not just about me anymore. She's got the whole neighborhood scared. "Even better," Derek said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Conspiracy and intimidation charges carry a lot more weight than simple property destruction. Keep building the case, and when you're ready to make a move, call me. I know people who would be very interested in an HOA president who thinks she's above federal law." After we hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Karen had been operating under the assumption that she was dealing with an isolated individual, someone she could overwhelm with bureaucracy and community pressure. What she didn't understand was that the badge might have been put away, but the network that came with it was still very much active. Over the next few days, I put that network to work. A call to Detective Maria Santos in the Financial Crimes Unit got me information about proper procedures for investigating potential HOA fraud. A conversation with Agent Jennifer Park from the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force gave me insight into what federal agencies looked for in cases involving abuse of power by local officials. Most importantly, a chat with my old friend Marcus. Webb, now a state investigator specializing in municipal corruption, revealed that Karen's little kingdom might not be as secure as she thought. HOA boards are supposed to operate with transparency, Marcus explained during our coffee meeting at a diner outside the neighborhood. Regular meetings, public records, financial disclosures, the whole 9 yards. If she's been running secret meetings and making unilateral decisions, that's a violation of state nonprofit corporation law. "She definitely hasn't been following proper procedures," I said, sliding a folder across the table. "I started checking after you mentioned it. The last publicly announced HOA meeting was 8 months ago, but she's been issuing new regulations and fines like she has full board authority." Marcus flipped through the documentation I'd compiled. Copies of every citation, photographs of the fake violation notices, records of the suspicious charges that had been appearing on neighbors' HOA bills. His expression grew more serious with each page. "Jesus, Tommy," he said finally. "This woman is running a one-person criminal enterprise disguised as an HOA. Look at these billing irregularities, landscaping charges for work that was never done, security fees for cameras that don't exist, maintenance assessments that go straight into accounts her husband controls." The more we dug, the clearer the picture became. Karen wasn't just a power-hungry neighborhood tyrant. She was a criminal who'd figured out how to use HOA authority to run sophisticated fraud schemes. The truck incident hadn't been about community standards. It had been about eliminating someone she saw as a potential threat to her operations. "She made a mistake targeting you," Marcus said, closing the folder. Most people don't have the background to recognize organized fraud when they see it, and even fewer have the resources to investigate it properly. But you do. That evening, I set up what Derek would have called a proper surveillance operation. I installed discrete security cameras around my property. Nothing that violated any legitimate HOA rules, but sophisticated enough to document every interaction, every piece of harassment, every attempt at intimidation. I created encrypted files for all my evidence, with copies stored in multiple secure locations. Most importantly, I started conducting what amounted to a neighborhood investigation. Casual conversations with dog walkers revealed that I wasn't the only one receiving suspicious citations. A chat with the mailman confirmed that Karen had been intercepting mail for multiple residents, not just me. Even brief interactions at the grocery store started revealing a pattern of financial irregularities that went far beyond simple power trips. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow from 3 streets over, approached me during one of my evening walks. She'd been watching for me, she said, and had something she needed to show someone with law enforcement experience. I didn't know who else to talk to, she said, her hands shaking as she handed me a folder full of HOA correspondence. Karen's been sending me these bills for landscaping work that was never done on my property. But when I tried to dispute them, she threatened to put a lien on my house. The documents Mrs. Patterson showed me were damning. Karen had been billing residents for services that were never provided, using the HOA's authority to collect payments for her husband's landscaping company, and threatening foreclosure against anyone who questioned the charges. It was a sophisticated extortion scheme that had been flying under the radar because most victims were elderly residents who didn't understand their rights. That night, I called Derek back with an update. "She's not just harassing me," I told him. "She's been running a criminal enterprise out of the HOA office, and I've got documentation going back at least 2 years. Elder fraud, mail tampering, intimidation, conspiracy, this is RICO territory." "Holy shit, Tommy," Derek said. "You went looking for a neighborhood dispute and found a federal case. How do you want to handle this?" "Carefully," I said, looking across the street at Karen's house, where the lights were still on and I could see her silhouette moving behind the curtains. "She thinks she destroyed my truck and scared me into submission. She has no idea that all she did was give law enforcement a reason to take a very close look at everything she's been doing." "The truck's going to be the least of her problems," Derek agreed. "When federal investigators start pulling her financial records and interviewing her victims, she's going to wish all she was facing was a property destruction charge." Karen Weatherby had spent 3 years building her little criminal kingdom, confident that her victims were too scared or too isolated to fight back effectively. What she hadn't counted on was picking a fight with someone who still had connections to the state police task force, someone who knew how to build criminal cases, and someone who had access to resources that stretched far beyond the borders of suburban Michigan. She thought she was dealing with just another neighbor she could bully into submission. She was about to discover that she'd just declared war on the entire network of law enforcement professionals who made their living taking down people exactly like her. The hidden badge might not have been visible, but it was about to become the most important piece of evidence in a case that would bring down everything Karen had built. The more I fought back quietly, the more she turned the neighborhood into a battlefield. The elderly couple lived 4 houses down from me, Harold and Evelyn Steinberg, married 53 years, retired teachers who'd spent their lives serving their community and asked nothing more than to be left alone in their golden years. They'd raised 3 children in that house, had hosted countless neighborhood barbecues, and had been the unofficial grandparents to every kid on Maple Grove Drive. Karen destroyed them over a flagpole. I was walking my dog on a Tuesday morning when I saw Harold standing in his front yard, staring at an official-looking document with the expression of someone who just watched his world collapse. Evelyn stood beside him, her hand on his arm, both of them looking lost and defeated in a way that made my chest tight with rage. "Everything okay, Mr. Steinberg?" I asked, approaching carefully. Since Karen's harassment campaign had begun, many of my neighbors had started treating me like I was contagious, afraid that association with me would make them targets. Harold looked up, his eyes watery behind thick glasses. "She's fining us $1,500 for having an unauthorized flagpole," he said, his voice cracking. "Says it violates the community aesthetic standards and has to be removed immediately." The flagpole in question was a modest 6-foot aluminum pole that Harold had installed to fly an American flag in honor of his late son, Michael, who'd been killed in Iraq in 2009. It wasn't ostentatious or inappropriate, just a simple memorial that meant everything to a father who'd lost his child in service to his country. "The flag has been up for 15 years, Evelyn added, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Nobody ever complained before. We asked permission when we installed it, and the old HOA board approved it in writing." I took the citation from Harold's trembling hands and read through Karen's latest masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty. She'd cited Section 12.4c, unauthorized structural modifications, and demanded that the flagpole be removed within 48 hours or face additional penalties, including potential legal action to place a lien on their property. "She can't do this," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the fury building in my chest. "You have written approval from the previous board, which creates a legal precedent." She'd have to call a full HOA meeting and get majority approval to revoke that permission. "She says the old approval is invalid because it wasn't properly filed with the county," Harold said. "Says if we don't comply, she'll have us foreclosed on for non-payment of fines." Foreclosure. Over a memorial flagpole for their dead son. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking, even by Karen's standards. This wasn't about community aesthetics or property values. This was about demonstrating power, showing the neighborhood what happened to anyone who had something Karen wanted to take away. "Mr. Steinberg, can I see the original approval document?" I asked. "I think I might be able to help." Harold disappeared into his house and returned with a folder full of meticulously organized paperwork, the kind of careful record-keeping that came from a lifetime of teaching and dealing with bureaucracy. The original HOA approval was right there, signed by 3 board members and properly notarized. More importantly, it referenced a county permit that had been filed and approved through the proper channels. Karen's citation was complete fabrication. She'd invented a violation that didn't exist, cited regulations that didn't apply, and threatened legal action she had no authority to take. It was fraud, plain and simple, but executed with enough official-looking paperwork to intimidate people who didn't know their rights. "This approval is completely valid," I told them. "Karen is lying about the county requirements, and she doesn't have the authority to revoke previous board decisions unilaterally. But more than that, threatening foreclosure over bogus fines is extortion." I spent the next hour explaining their rights and helping them draft a response that cited the relevant state laws and HOA governance requirements. But even as we worked, I could see the damage Karen had already done. Harold, who'd served his country in Vietnam and spent 40 years teaching high school mathematics, was shaken to his core by the thought of losing his home. Evelyn kept apologizing for causing trouble, as if honoring their son's memory was somehow a neighborhood disruption. The Steinbergs weren't Karen's only victims that week. 2 days later, I witnessed her next act of suburban terrorism when she confronted the Martinez family about their children's sidewalk chalk drawings. Sophia Martinez was 7 years old, a bright-eyed kid who spent hours creating elaborate hopscotch courts and rainbow murals on the public sidewalk in front of her house. Her artwork was temporary, harmless, and brought smiles to everyone who walked by. Karen saw it as a violation of Section 9.3a, defacement of common areas. I was coming back from a run when I saw Karen standing over little Sophia with her clipboard and her phone, taking pictures of chalk flowers and butterflies like she was documenting a crime scene. Sophia was crying, and her mother, Carmen, was trying to explain in broken English that the chalk would wash away with the next rain. Community standards apply to all residents regardless of age, Karen was saying in her most officious tone. Children need to learn that there are consequences for violating community rules. This is a $50 fine for each instance of defacement, $50 per drawing. Sophia had created maybe a dozen chalk masterpieces over the past few weeks, which meant Karen was threatening the Martinez family with hundreds of dollars in fines for letting their kid be a kid. "Are you seriously fining a 7-year-old for drawing with chalk?" I asked, stopping my run to intervene. Karen turned to me with that smug expression I'd come to despise. "Community rules apply to everyone, Thompson. Maybe if you'd learned that lesson, you'd still have a truck." "Sidewalks are public property," I said, stepping between Karen and the little girl. "The HOA has no authority to regulate children's chalk drawings on public walkways. What you're doing is harassment." "What I'm doing is protecting property values," Karen shot back. "These people need to learn that there are standards in this neighborhood. If they don't like it, they can move somewhere more suitable to their lifestyle." The way she said lifestyle made it clear that this wasn't just about chalk drawings. The Martinez family was one of only 3 Hispanic families in our predominantly white neighborhood, and Karen's harassment of them had a distinctly discriminatory edge that went beyond her usual power trips. But Karen's masterpiece of cruelty came the following week when she targeted the Thompson family. No relation to me, despite the shared surname. Jim and Sarah Thompson had lived in the neighborhood for 8 years and had twin boys with severe autism. The boys, Michael and David, were 12 years old and required constant supervision, specialized diets, and medical equipment that included a generator for power-dependent devices. Karen decided their generator violated noise ordinances. 14 found out about it when Sarah Thompson knocked on my door at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, tears streaming down her face and her hands shaking as she held yet another of Karen's official-looking citations. "She wants us to remove the generator," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if we don't have backup power for David's breathing equipment—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. I'd seen enough to know that Karen's latest violation notice was potentially life-threatening. The generator in question was a medical-grade unit that ran quietly in the Thompsons' backyard, barely audible from 20 feet away and essential for maintaining the specialized medical equipment that kept David alive. "She can't do this," I said, inviting Sarah inside and offering her a glass of water while I read through the citation. Medical equipment is protected under both federal disability law and state health regulations. This isn't just harassment. This is potentially criminal. But that was exactly what Karen was counting on. She knew most people didn't understand their legal rights, didn't have the resources to fight back, and would rather pay fines or comply with bogus demands than risk escalating a conflict with someone who held power over their housing situation. The pattern was becoming clear. Karen targeted the most vulnerable members of the community. Elderly residents who were afraid of losing their homes, immigrant families who didn't fully understand their rights, parents of disabled children who couldn't risk disrupting their kids' stability. She picked victims who were least likely to fight back and most likely to simply comply with her demands rather than risk making things worse. But Karen had made a critical miscalculation. By targeting so many people, she'd created a network of victims who were starting to find each other. The Steinbergs began talking to the Martinez family about their shared experiences with Karen's harassment. The Thompsons started comparing notes with other families who'd received suspicious citations, and they all started talking too. Me, Mrs. Patterson from 3 streets over, wasn't. The only elderly resident being billed for services that were never performed. The Chens had been receiving noise complaints for practicing violin. Mrs. Chen was a retired music teacher who gave lessons to neighborhood children. The Johnsons had been cited for excessive vehicle traffic because they had the audacity to host family dinners on Sundays. Every conversation revealed new layers of Karen's systematic abuse. She'd been using her position to settle personal grudges, eliminate activities she didn't approve of, and create streams of revenue through fabricated violations and inflated service charges. The HOA had become her personal ATM machine, with neighbors' homes serving as collateral for whatever whim or vendetta caught her attention. The breakthrough came during what started as a casual conversation with Mike Henderson, a guy I'd occasionally talked sports with during neighborhood walks. He'd been avoiding me since the truck incident, but desperation finally overcame fear when Karen targeted his teenage daughter. "She's saying Emma's car is commercial use because she delivers pizza part-time," Mike said, looking around nervously as we stood in his driveway. "Wants to fine us $500 and ban Emma from parking in our own driveway. Emma's saving up for college, man. She's a good kid, just trying to earn some money." "Mike, how many other people has she been targeting?" I asked. "Because I'm starting to think this is bigger than just random harassment." That's when Mike pulled out his phone and showed me something that changed everything. A private neighborhood social media group that Karen didn't know existed. It had started as a way for residents to share information about Karen's escalating demands, but it had evolved into something more significant, a support network for victims who were finally starting to realize they weren't alone. The group had 63 members out of maybe 100 total households in the neighborhood. Story after story of harassment, intimidation, and fraud. Photos of bogus citations, copies of threatening letters, recordings of Karen's verbal abuse during compliance inspections. Most importantly, financial records that showed a clear pattern of corruption. Karen had been systematically billing residents for services that benefited only her family's businesses, creating fake violations to generate fine revenue, and using the threat of foreclosure to extort compliance with increasingly unreasonable demands. "Jesus Christ," I said, scrolling through months of documented abuse. "She's been running a criminal enterprise out of the HOA office, and she's gotten away with it because everyone was too scared to compare notes." "We tried fighting back individually," Mike said. "But she always had an answer, always had some regulation or bylaw that justified whatever she wanted to do. It wasn't until people started talking to each other that we realized she was making most of it up." That night, I made calls to Derek, Marcus, and Detective Santos, sharing what I'd discovered about Karen's systematic victimization of the entire neighborhood. What had started as a property destruction case was rapidly expanding into a federal investigation involving mail fraud, extortion, elder abuse, and civil rights violations. "She's not just a neighborhood bully," I told Derek during our call. "She's running the most sophisticated HOA fraud scheme I've ever seen. And she's been doing it for years." The truck incident was just the tip of the iceberg. "How many victims are we talking about?" Derek asked. "At least 60 families that I can document, probably more who are too scared to come forward yet. She's stolen thousands of dollars, targeted disabled children and elderly residents, and turned an entire neighborhood into her personal kingdom through fear and intimidation." Karen had thought she was smart, picking off victims one by one while keeping them isolated and afraid. What she hadn't counted on was creating so many victims that they'd eventually find each other. She'd turned my neighborhood into a battlefield, but battles could go both ways. And now she was about to discover what happened when her victims stopped being afraid and started working together. I wasn't the only one preparing for battle. Karen had no idea the storm that was brewing inside her own neighborhood. The first secret meeting took place in Harold Steinberg's garage on a rainy Thursday evening in October. It wasn't planned as anything dramatic, Just a few neighbors getting together to compare notes about Karen's latest round of harassment. But as more people showed up, drawn by whispered conversations and shared frustrations, it became something much more significant. By the time we closed the garage door, there were 23 people crowded into the space, representing households that Karen had targeted over the past 3 years. The diversity of her victims was staggering. Elderly couples, young families, single parents, retirees, immigrants, disabled residents, and everyone in between. The only thing they had in common was that Karen had found some way to make their lives miserable. "Before we start," I said, standing near Harold's workbench with my folder of evidence, "everyone needs to understand what we're really talking about here. This isn't just about neighborhood disputes or HOA overreach. What Karen has been doing is criminal, and if we're going to stop her, we need to do it the right way." The stories that came out that night painted a picture of systematic abuse that was even worse than I'd imagined. Mrs. Patterson's billing irregularities weren't isolated incidents. Karen had been running fake landscaping charges through at least a dozen accounts. The Steinbergs' flagpole wasn't the only memorial she'd targeted. She'd forced the Kowalski family to remove a small garden memorial for their daughter who died in a car accident, Carmen. Martinez revealed that the chalk citation was just the latest in a series of discriminatory actions targeting her family. Karen had complained to code enforcement about their excessive outdoor lighting, actually just string lights for a daughter's birthday party. She'd filed noise complaints about their family gatherings, despite the fact that other families regularly hosted much larger and louder events without consequence. But the most disturbing revelation came from Janet Morrison, a single mother whose 17-year-old son had autism. Karen had been systematically targeting David Morrison for months, citing him for loitering when he waited for the school bus, disturbing the peace when he engaged in harmless stimming behaviors, and suspicious activity when he took his daily walks through the neighborhood. She told me that David made other residents uncomfortable and that I needed to control his behavior or face escalating fines, Janet said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. She suggested I should consider moving somewhere more appropriate for my son's special needs. The room went silent. Even by Karen's standards, targeting a disabled teenager was particularly vicious. But it also represented something that could bring federal civil rights investigators into the picture. Discrimination against disabled individuals in housing was a violation that carried serious criminal penalties. As the meeting continued, a pattern emerged that went beyond simple harassment. Karen's actions weren't random or impulsive. They were calculated moves in a larger strategy to consolidate power and generate revenue. She'd been systematically targeting anyone who might challenge her authority while extracting money from vulnerable residents who couldn't fight back. "Here's what I think happened," I said, spreading out a timeline I'd been building. Karen saw an opportunity when she got elected to the HOA board. She realized that most residents don't understand their rights, don't know how to fight bureaucratic harassment, and will pay fines rather than risk losing their homes. So she turned the HOA into her personal money-making machine. The numbers were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that Karen had extracted over $150,000 in bogus fines and fabricated service charges over the past 3 years. Her husband's landscaping company had received contracts worth another $200,000 for work that was either unnecessary, overpriced, or never performed. She'd used her position to generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue while terrorizing anyone who questioned her authority. "The question is, what do we do about it?" asked Mike Henderson. "She's got all the power, all the legal authority, and most people are still too scared to stand up to her." That's when I shared what I'd been working on behind the scenes. My connections with the task force had opened doors that individual residents couldn't access. Detective Santos had confirmed that several of Karen's actions constituted felony fraud. Agent Park from the FBI had expressed interest in the civil rights violations. Most importantly, Marcus Webb had connected me with Assistant District Attorney Linda Rodriguez, who specialized in public corruption cases. "I've been building a criminal case against Karen for the past month," I said. "Mail fraud, extortion, elder abuse, civil rights violations, conspiracy. We've got evidence for charges that could put her away for years. But to make it stick, we need victims willing to come forward officially." The garage fell silent again. Coming forward meant exposing themselves to Karen's retaliation, meant admitting they'd been victimized, meant potentially becoming targets for escalated harassment. For most of the people in that room, keeping their heads down and paying Karen's illegal fines seemed safer than fighting back. But Harold Steinberg, all 83 years of him, stood up from his folding chair and walked over to where I was standing. "My son died defending this country's freedoms," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen enough of life to know what mattered. "I'll be damned if I'm going to let some suburban dictator destroy my neighborhood with her illegal schemes. Where do I sign?" Evelyn Steinberg was the second person to volunteer. Then Carmen Martinez, despite her fear about immigration status and potential retaliation. Janet Morrison stepped forward for her son, David. One by one, the victims in Harold's garage committed to fighting back officially. By the end of the meeting, we had 18 households willing to provide testimony and evidence for a criminal case against Karen. More importantly, we had something that Karen had never expected us to develop: organization. The next phase of the operation required more sophisticated coordination. Derek Hayes connected me with Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kim, who ran the state police's Community Corruption Task Force. She'd been looking for a case like this. Systematic HOA fraud was an emerging problem across suburban Michigan, and prosecuting Karen successfully could set precedents that would help victims in other communities. "What you've uncovered here is textbook organized crime," Lieutenant Kim told me during our first meeting. "RICO violations, conspiracy, systematic fraud. This woman has been running the HOA like a criminal enterprise. The fact that she targeted disabled and elderly residents adds federal jurisdiction. The investigation that followed was like watching a military operation unfold." Detective Kim's team began conducting formal interviews with victims, documenting evidence, and building the kind of comprehensive case that could withstand challenges from expensive defense attorneys. The FBI's Public Corruption Unit opened their own investigation into the civil rights violations. The State Attorney General's office launched an inquiry into HOA governance violations. But the most satisfying development came when Ada Rodriguez called to inform me that they'd obtained warrants to search Karen's financial records. "We found accounts that go back 5 years," she said. "Systematic billing fraud, kickback schemes with her husband's company, embezzlement of HOA funds. She's been running a criminal enterprise disguised as neighborhood governance. We're looking at felony charges that carry serious prison time." While the official investigation was building momentum, Karen remained completely oblivious to the storm gathering around her. She continued issuing bogus citations, continued threatening residents with foreclosure, continued believing that her victims were too scared and isolated to fight back effectively. That illusion was shattered when she made the mistake of escalating her harassment campaign. Against me personally, the citation appeared on my door on a Tuesday morning. Final notice: violation of multiple community standards. According to Karen's latest masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction, I was facing $5,000 in accumulated fines and had 48 hours to pay in full or face immediate legal action to protect community interests. $5,000 for violations that didn't exist, regulations that had been fabricated, and authority that Karen didn't legally possess. It was extortion, plain and simple, and she'd put it in writing with her signature at the bottom. That same day, I received a phone call from Lieutenant Kim. "She just made a critical mistake," the detective said. Issuing a fake legal ultimatum in writing, with specific dollar amounts and time limits, that's textbook extortion. We have enough evidence to arrest her right now. Not yet, I said, looking across the street at Karen's house, where she was probably planning her next act of neighborhood tyranny. She's called a special HOA meeting for tomorrow night. Says she's going to announce major enforcement initiatives and significant changes to ensure community compliance. I think she's planning to escalate against multiple families at once. Perfect, Lieutenant Kim said. Let her commit her crimes in public, in front of witnesses. The more evidence she creates, the stronger our case becomes. Karen had no idea that she was about to walk into a room full of victims who were no longer afraid. Witnesses who were working with law enforcement, and evidence that would destroy everything she'd built. She thought she was calling a meeting to demonstrate her power and crush any remaining resistance. Instead, she was about to face the reckoning that had been building for 3 years. The gathering storm was about to break, and Karen Weatherby was standing directly in its path. It all came down to one night, the HOA meeting. The moment Karen believed she would finally crush me, only to face her downfall in front of everyone. The Maple Grove Community Center had never seen a crowd like this. By 7 o'clock, every seat was filled and people were standing along the walls. Karen had expected her usual audience of maybe a dozen residents who showed up out of obligation or fear. Instead, she was facing nearly 80 people, almost every household in the neighborhood, plus a few faces she didn't recognize. What she couldn't see were the recording devices scattered throughout the room, the plainclothes detectives positioned near the exits, and the federal agents sitting quietly in the back row. Lieutenant Kim had coordinated the whole operation like a military exercise, ensuring that every illegal action would be documented and every witness would be protected. Karen sat at the front table in her power outfit, a ritoti, tar santonthi, burgundy blazer with gold buttons that screamed authority. Figure, shuffling through a stack of papers thick enough to be a phone book. Her husband Richard sat beside her, nervously adjusting his tie and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The other board members, what few remained, looked equally uncomfortable. I took a seat in the third row, close enough to see Karen's face, but far enough back to blend into the crowd. Around me sat the neighbors who'd become more than victims. They were witnesses now, ready to speak truth to power in a way that would change everything. "Good evening, residents," Karen began, standing up and surveying the crowd with the satisfaction of a queen addressing her subjects. "Thank you all for attending this special meeting. As you know, we've been dealing with some compliance issues in our community, and it's time to address them definitively. She clicked a remote, and a PowerPoint presentation appeared on the wall screen behind her. The first slide read, Enforcement Initiative, Protecting Property Values Through Accountability. Over the past few months, we've identified numerous violations of our community covenants, Karen continued, her voice carrying that familiar tone of condescending authority. Some residents seem to believe that rules don't apply to them, that their personal preferences matter more than community standards. The next slide showed photographs of various violations: Harold's flagpole, the Martinez children's chalk drawings, my destroyed truck, Janet Morrison's son waiting for the school bus. Each image was labeled with violation numbers and proposed fines that ranged from hundreds to thousands of dollars. A murmur of anger rippled through the crowd. People were seeing their neighbors' crimes displayed like evidence at a trial, and the absurdity of Karen's accusations was becoming impossible to ignore. "These enforcement actions are not personal," Karen said, advancing to the next slide. "They are necessary steps to preserve the character and value of our neighborhood. Effective immediately, we will be implementing enhanced compliance monitoring and escalated penalties for repeat offenders." Enhanced compliance monitoring. That was Karen's euphemism for the surveillance network she'd been building. The cameras pointed at specific houses, The neighbors recruited to spy on each other. She was announcing the transformation of our community into a police state, and she was doing it with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. Now, I know some of you may have questions about these initiatives, she continued, but I want to be clear that these decisions have been made by the board in consultation with our legal advisors. They are not subject to debate or reversal. That's when Harold Steinberg stood up. "Point of order," he said in his retired teacher voice, the one that had commanded respect in classrooms for 40 years. According to HOA bylaws, enforcement policies require a vote by the full membership. You can't unilaterally impose new regulations without community approval. Karen's smile faltered slightly. "Mr. Steinberg, I appreciate your concern, but emergency enforcement measures can be implemented by board authority when community standards are being systematically violated." "Show me where it says that in the bylaws," Harold replied, pulling out his own copy of the HOA governance documents, "because I've read them very carefully, and I don't see any provision for unilateral emergency powers." That's when I stood up, my folder of evidence in hand. "While we're discussing bylaws," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room, "maybe we should talk about all the ways Karen has been violating them herself." Karen's face went pale. "Mr. Thompson, you are out of order. Sit down immediately." "Actually, I think everyone here needs to hear this," I said, walking toward the front of the room, "because what Karen has been calling enforcement is actually systematic criminal fraud." I clicked my own remote. "Lieutenant, Kim's team had helped me prepare a presentation that would tell the story Karen didn't want told. The first slide showed copies of bogus citations with forged signatures, fabricated violation codes, and charges for services that were never provided. Ladies and gentlemen, for the past 3 years, Karen Weatherby has been using her position to run what can only be described as a criminal enterprise. Fake fines, inflated service charges, intimidation tactics, and systematic harassment of anyone who questioned her authority." Karen was on her feet now, her face flushed with rage. "This is defamatory. Security! Remove this man immediately!" But there was no security, and the crowd was completely focused on the evidence I was displaying. Financial records showing how Karen's husband's company had received hundreds of thousands of dollars in HOA contracts for work that was never done or grossly overpriced. Documentation of her systematic targeting of elderly residents, immigrant families, and disabled individuals. Here's Mrs. Patterson being billed for landscaping work that was never performed on her property, I said, advancing to the next slide. Here's the Martinez family being cited for letting their children draw with chalk on public sidewalks. Here's Janet Morrison being harassed because her autistic son makes Karen uncomfortable. The room erupted. People were standing up, shouting questions, demanding explanations. Karen tried to maintain control, banging a gavel and calling for order, but her authority had evaporated the moment the truth started coming out. "And here," I said, clicking to the final slide, "is the recording that Karen doesn't know. Exists, her own voice admitting that she targeted me because she wanted to make an example of someone who might challenge her authority." The audio was crystal clear, captured by Mrs. Chen's security system during one of Karen's compliance inspections. I don't care if his truck was legal or not. People like Thompson think they can do whatever they want because they used to carry a badge. Well, he's going to learn that I run this neighborhood now, and anyone who doesn't like it can get the same treatment. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen stood at the front of the room, exposed and cornered, her carefully constructed image of authority crumbling in real time. Richard had buried his face in his hands. The other board members were staring at their phones, probably calling attorneys. That's when Lieutenant Kim stood up from her seat in the back. "Karen Weatherby," she said, her badge visible as she walked down the aisle. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, elder abuse, and civil rights violations. You have the right to remain silent." The next few minutes were chaos. Karen screaming about illegal searches and false accusations, Richard being led away in his own set of handcuffs, board members trying to distance themselves from policies they'd rubber-stamped without reading, neighbors crying, cheering, and finally understanding that their nightmare was over. But for me, the most satisfying moment came as Karen was being escorted toward the exit. She turned back to glare at me one last time, and I saw something in her eyes that I recognized from dozens of other arrests. The moment when a criminal finally realized that their victims had fought back and won. "You have no idea what you've done," she hissed as the detective guided her toward the door. "This neighborhood will fall apart without proper leadership." "No, Karen," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This neighborhood will finally be free." As the police cars pulled away with their prisoners, the community center buzzed with conversations that hadn't been possible for 3 years. Neighbors talking openly about their experiences, sharing phone numbers, making plans to rebuild the community that Karen had almost destroyed. Harold Steinberg approached me as I was packing up my evidence. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." "Thank you for being brave enough to stand up first," I replied. "This wouldn't have happened without people like you and Evelyn being willing to fight back." Outside, the sound of my rebuilt truck's engine was running smooth and strong. The task force had helped with the restoration, and she was better than new. Upgraded, reinforced, and ready for whatever came next. But more than that, she was a symbol of something Karen had never understood. That service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. And some battles are worth fighting no matter the cost. Fighting no matter the cost. As I drove home through streets that finally felt safe again, I could see neighbors standing in their yards, talking to each other without fear for the first time in years. Children's chalk drawings decorated the sidewalks. Harold's flag flew proudly in his front yard. Karen Weatherby had tried to turn our neighborhood into her personal kingdom, but she'd underestimated the power of people standing together for what's right. She'd thought she was facing down one isolated veteran with a grudge. Instead, she'd declared war on an entire community, and she'd lost. The sound of my truck's rebuilt engine roared back to life. But this time, it wasn't just my victory. It was the neighborhood's. 6 months later, I stood in my driveway on a Saturday morning, running my hand along the hood of my truck in the same ritual I'd performed for years. But everything was different now. The engine hummed with mechanical perfection, courtesy of the task force's elite mechanics, who'd rebuilt her with upgrades that made her better than factory new. The bullet-resistant windows had been replaced with even stronger glass. The communications array was state-of-the-art. Even the paint job was pristine, covering the old scars while somehow honoring their memory. She wasn't just my truck anymore. She'd become something of a neighborhood legend. Kids would walk by and ask if it was the police truck that caught the bad lady. Parents would point it out during evening strolls, telling their children about how sometimes the good guys really do win. The Martinez kids had even left a chalk drawing of a truck surrounded by flowers on my driveway, with "Hero Car" written in rainbow letters. The criminal case against Karen had unfolded exactly as Lieutenant Kim had predicted. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of dozens of victims, her expensive defense attorneys had advised her to take a plea deal rather than risk a trial that would have resulted in even more serious charges. She'd been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violations, with an additional 2 years of supervised probation and restitution payments that would continue for the rest of her life. Richard had received 18 months for his role in the landscaping fraud scheme, though his cooperation with prosecutors had kept him from facing the more serious conspiracy charges. The other board members had been given probation and community service, their political careers effectively ended by their association with Karen's crimes. But the real justice had been in watching our neighborhood transform itself from Karen's. surveillance state back into an actual community. The first change had been symbolic but important. Harold's flag was still flying, joined now by several others, as neighbors decided to honor their own family members who'd served. The Martinez children's chalk art had become a neighborhood tradition, with other kids joining in to create elaborate sidewalk galleries that changed weekly. Janet Morrison's son David was no longer hiding indoors. He'd become something of a celebrity among the younger kids, who thought his encyclopedic knowledge of trains and buses was the coolest thing ever. The financial recovery had been more complex, but equally satisfying. The federal investigation had frozen all of Karen's assets, including the accounts where she'd been hiding HOA funds. Restitution payments were being distributed to victims based on documented losses, with elderly residents like Mrs. Patterson receiving substantial compensation for the fraudulent charges they'd paid over the years. More importantly, the new HOA board, elected in a special vote that had seen unprecedented turnout, had implemented transparency measures that would prevent another Karen from ever taking power. All meetings were now public. All financial records were available for inspection, and major policy changes required approval by a majority of residents. Rather than unilateral board action, the community had also established what we called the Neighborhood Watch, not the surveillance network Karen had created, but an actual mutual support system where neighbors looked out for each other. When Mrs. Chen had fallen and broken her hip, meals had appeared on her doorstep for weeks. When the Johnsons' teenage daughter had gotten into college but couldn't afford the tuition, the neighborhood had organized a scholarship fund that covered her first year. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the silence of fear being replaced by the sounds of life. Children playing in yards without worrying about noise complaints. Families hosting barbecues without measuring grass height or counting parked cars. Elderly residents sitting on their porches in the evening without fear of citations for loitering on their own property. The block party we held in September, our first official neighborhood celebration in 4 years, had drawn nearly everyone. Grills were set up in the street. Kids ran between houses like the entire neighborhood was their backyard. And for the first time since I'd moved here, Maple Grove Estates felt like the community it was supposed to be. I'd been asked to say a few words at that party, to commemorate what everyone was calling the victory over Karen. But standing there looking at families laughing together, at Harold teaching David Martinez how to properly fold an American flag, at neighbors who'd been strangers 6 months earlier now planning Christmas decorating committees, I realized that the real victory wasn't in defeating Karen. The real victory was in proving that communities could heal, that neighbors could stand together when it mattered, and that bullies, no matter how much power they accumulated, would eventually face people who refused to be intimidated. You know what I learned from all this? I'd said that day, looking out at faces that had become genuinely familiar and friendly. Karen thought power came from making people afraid. But real strength comes from giving people hope. She spent 3 years trying to divide us, control us, and profit from our fear. But the moment we started standing together, her whole empire collapsed. Derek had been at that party, along with several other task force members who'd helped with the truck restoration and the investigation. Seeing him interact with my neighbors, talking shop with Harold about military service, helping Martinez kids understand how police helicopters worked, listening respectfully as Mrs. Patterson explained. Her victory garden techniques reminded me why I'd chosen law enforcement in the first place. It wasn't about the adrenaline or the authority or even the satisfaction of catching bad guys. It was about protecting communities like this, about ensuring that good people could live their lives without fear of predators, whether those predators carried guns in dark alleys or clipboards in suburban neighborhoods. My extended leave was ending next month, and I'd been cleared for return to active duty with the task force, the department. Psychologists had been impressed by my community, integration, and positive resolution of civilian conflict, which was their professional way of saying that taking down Karen had been better therapy than anything they could have provided. But I'd also been given another option. A transfer to the Community Corruption Unit that Lieutenant Kim ran. My experience with HOA fraud had made me something of an expert in suburban crime, and there were apparently dozens of other communities dealing with similar problems. Other Karens in other neighborhoods, running their own little criminal enterprises while hiding behind the veneer of community leadership. You've got a choice to make. Tommy, Derek had told me during one of our regular check-ins, you can come back to the task force and get back to chasing the same violent criminals we've always chased. Or you can take this new assignment and help communities that are dealing with the same thing. You just